Hello, it's John Lopez. We're continuing our series on dreams in the Bible, and we've come to the part where we're in Genesis chapter 40, where Joseph is in prison and he interprets the two dreams that of the other two prisoners. Um, just to give you the background, kind of how we get here, Joseph has some dreams. He tells his brothers. His brothers seem to understand that the plain meaning of it is that eventually he will have a place over them in authority, and that they will be submitted to him, that he'll be raised up above them. However that happens, they don't like it. They at one point they're angry at him for other things, and they decide to sell him to some slave traders who are on their way to Egypt. So he ends up being sold as a slave to some slave traders. They take him down to Egypt. They sell him to the captain of the guard of Pharaoh, a military official, and he buys Joseph as his slave. He does really well. He promotes him to the highest position as his head slave, who's in charge of all the other servants, and then his Potiphar's wife, that's the guy, his the master. Uh, she casts longing eyes on him. She wants to have sex with him. He refuses her. She accuses him of attempting to rape her. Then he is thrown into prison, and this is where he is now. And when he gets to prison, what it says, this is the end of chapter 39, starting verse 21, it says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison, and the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it to prosper." So he's doing about as good as you can do in prison. Um, this is not probably how he expected his dream to somehow work its way out, that his brothers would eventually bow down to him, but it's working its way there. And we kind of know the story if you read it, if you've ever read it before. But you get to chapter 40, and I'm just going to start reading, and we'll stop periodically and just kind of take a look at certain things. It came to pass after these things that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. So he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, so they were in custody for a while. It does not say anywhere in this text what they did. What it does say is that Pharaoh was angry with his two officers. Now, one of the things we'll find is we're looking at this. This is the chief butler and the chief baker for the Pharaoh. Some translations translate him as the first one as the chief cupbearer. And apparently that was one of the roles that the chief butler was. He was in charge of the wine. Possibly, I would imagine, maybe he was even somebody people used to like to get rid of the king by poisoning him. So oftentimes what you had is you had to have people that you trusted. Then they would maybe taste the wine before they gave it to Pharaoh, and if anything bad happened to them, then they knew not to drink it. And so, kind of like he was the barrier between those and those who wanted, between the Pharaoh and those who wanted to kill him. Also, and you have the chief baker. The chief baker is also very important because you can also put poison into people's foods. I was in a restaurant one time and there was a little thing and it had like little, famous sayings from famous people, things to do with food and restaurants and things like that. And they were all quite amusing. And there was one that was in the middle of them or in the list, and it says, I don't remember who said it, but it said, always be nice to people who are alone with your food. That is some good advice. And it made me a little uncomfortable at that restaurant when I read it. So, always be nice to people who are alone with your food. So this is what happened. So they put them, they're both, so for some reason, Pharaoh was angry at them. I think another translation I read said that they had offended him in some way. So there was something that they did, maybe separately or maybe together. They did something that got him angry at them, and it was bad enough to where he felt like, you guys are going to jail. So he threw him in prison. Joseph is in charge of them. And starting in verse 5, it says, then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream. Both of them, each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation. And Joseph came to them in the morning and looked at them and saw that they were sad. So he asked the Pharaoh's officers, who were with him in the custody of his lord's house, saying, why do you look so sad today? And they said to him, we each have had a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. So Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me, please. So Joseph asked the questions, do not interpretations belong to God? And so they're upset. Their reason for being upset is that each one of them had a dream and there was nobody there to interpret them. We do know from archaeology and that the Egyptians were very much focused in on dreams, especially after this time. They've found documents where, after the time that Joseph actually lived in Egypt, they've actually found whole books that tell you how to interpret dreams, to give you the symbol and what it means, and so you could just kind of look at these books. Some of them I've heard some of the ways that they would go about them interpreting certain images or certain things in dreams sound okay. Others, I'm like, yeah, well, I don't know about that. But either way, there were people who were very much focused in on interpreting dreams in Egypt, and they were upset because they're in prison and there was nobody there. But Joseph says, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please. I think it's kind of interesting that Joseph understands that the only person who can interpret dreams 100% accurately would be God. But we, if we're Christians, if we're walking in fellowship with God, I think that it should be reasonable for us to expect or to be able to ask God for the interpretation of a dream or that we get or that someone else gets. And in Joseph's case, maybe he also maybe has been paying attention to dreams for a long time. His father had some pretty significant dreams. He had some significant dreams. I would imagine that he probably had more dreams than are actually written in the Bible. Most people have a lot of dreams that they don't share with people. And so this is the dream, the first dream. Then the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, behold, in my dream a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches. It was as though it budded, its blossom shot forth, and its clusters brought forth grapes. Then the Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, And I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler. But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me into the dungeon. And that word dungeon is actually the same Hebrew word that is used previously in the book of Genesis, where his brothers grabbed him and threw him into a pit. That word dungeon it means like a pit or a cistern. I'm imagining when I read this, because the way the word that it's used, that maybe this particular dungeon or prison was somehow maybe dug underground. I don't know. But either way, he describes it as a dungeon, as a pit, not a pleasant place. And he wants the baker to remember him when he gets out. But I want to just look at real quick, look at the Pharaoh's, I'm sorry, the butler's dream. And what he says is, behold, in my dream, a vine was before me. And in the vine were 3 branches. And then what happens is those branches go through 3 different stages. It was as though it budded, its blossom shot forth, and its clusters brought forth grapes. So what you see is just the natural, well, it would be a natural progression of time if it was happening over a period of days or weeks, or but in the dream, it happens really quick. 1, 2, 3. There's blossoms, or it buds. There's blossoms. Next, there's grapes. So it moves along forward with time. One of the things when I looked at this initially, I thought to myself, how did he get 3 days out of 3 branches? What does 3? I mean, I can see it's 3, but how would he know if it has anything to do with 3 days? And you do, I guess, I would say that maybe the hint was, other than the Spirit of God speaking to him, would be that there's a progression of time that's fairly natural, and it moves forward. And if you had watched grapevines grow, you would know that it starts to bud, and then the flowers show up, and the flowers then, once they're pollinated, they turn into grapes, or they produce grapes from that same part. So there is a natural, like a threefold progression of time. There's 3 branches, and then in verse 11 it says, then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. And this is, when I look at this, I think of some of the dreams I've had, or some of the dreams other people have. And what you'll find is that, say you're looking at an image or a scene or something, and then it switches, and you're like, and sometimes it seems like, oh, how did I get there? And that is just kind of the way the dream goes. It shows you a scene, and then it moves to another scene. So this is kind of, in a way, I've had dreams that I've written out, and a lot of times when I write them out, I'll get to a place and I'll say, it switches, or that means that it goes from, I'm here, I'm doing this thing, and then next thing I know, I'm somewhere else and I'm doing something else. So there's like a switch. So sometimes I'll just actually have one word, like it switches, or it changes, or something like that. And then the rest of the line is blank, and then I'll go into the next section. So it's almost like it's two different dreams, but they're all connected, and they actually are saying the same thing. They're kind of expanding maybe on the other thing. When I would say, if I would, so it says, then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And so he says, the three branches, Joseph says, the three branches are 3 days. And within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head, which is a Hebrew way of saying that he's going to restore your dignity or your position or your power. We kind of talk about, like, you know, I can lift my head up high now, something to that effect. And it says he will restore you to your place. There's a little footnote in my Bible, and it says place is also could be translated the word position. So basically, you're going to get your job back, and you can kind of see it in the dream. He is making wine, putting it in the cup, handing it to Pharaoh, and putting it in his hand, which is what he used to do before. So it's not completely that someone couldn't look at this dream necessarily and maybe figure it out with some kind of meditation or whatever, thinking about it. Um, One of the things that I would even do is, when I look at sometimes if somebody presents me with a dream, or I even get a dream of my own, I'll kind of brainstorm, like, like, what's going on in this dream? What do I think of when I think of vines and buds and flowers and grapes being produced? It's like there's an element of fruitfulness, of blessing, of growth. Um, Also, the idea that what it says is that Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. In the Bible, a lot of times the way that the Hebrew languages, the Bible will speak of things being in your hand, being within your power. It's almost like uh, the hand or the finger is representative of the power. Sometimes it talks about the hand of the Lord came on thee there, but what it's talking about is talking about the power coming on him. And so, like in this particular case, the cup is now his responsibility again, and he presses grapes into it, makes wine, which may have been part of his role making wine. I don't know. And then he places the cup into Pharaoh's hand, which is what he used to do before. So it's like he's back in his old job and he's doing what he normally would have done. So that is how Joseph goes about interpreting that dream for him. I do think that it's interesting that they're three branches, three stages of growth, and then the butler also does three different things. So he's standing there with the cup, he presses the wine into the cup, then he puts it into Pharaoh's hand. So there's even three different actions and also a progression moving forward. So it does seem to paint a picture of him being restored to his old position as butler to the king. And he asks the butler, please remember me when you get out of here, because I don't belong here. I was stolen away as a slave, and I haven't done anything to deserve being in prison. He is innocent. It's almost like a joke when you watch a prison movie. It's like, what did you do? In Shawshank Redemption, he's like, I'm an innocent man. I didn't do anything. And they all laugh. Turns out he actually was innocent, but in this particular case, Joseph is most likely the only innocent person in this prison. Maybe there's more. I don't know. And I'm guessing that the chief butler and the chief baker did do something um, that got them into trouble. All right. So, in starting in chapter 40, Genesis chapter 40, verse 16, when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, I also was in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. The footnote in my Bible, which tells you different ways that it could be translated, it says, or baskets of white bread. So they're not sure if they're talking about white baskets or white bread, but it says white and there's baskets and there's bread. In verse 17, it says, in the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh. Well, that seems almost pretty good for him, right? But it says, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head. So the breads, it says that there were baked goods in the baskets for Pharaoh, but the birds end up eating them. So Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. Ouch. So it's interesting to me that there are certain, like I would say that within my own dreams or even with other people's dreams, being familiar with Bible imagery or even the language that the Bible speaks, and I don't know if it's maybe part of it is the fact that I've put a lot of the Bible into my head, so my brain uses images and language from the Bible to communicate. But also, you would find here, you'd say, well, I would, and I kind of, and I, the thing is, if you were to look at this, you'd think, well, how did Joseph get that out of, there's baked goods for Pharaoh in the basket. There's 3 of them, 3 baskets on his head, and the top one, the birds come and eat the bread out of the top basket. Well, like, how is that indicating he's going to get his head cut off and he's going to be hung and the birds are going to eat his flesh? Uh, I suppose if you live in a city and you aren't around what happens to dead animals and roadkill and bodies that are left outside, that you might not be familiar with the fact that birds and animals will come and pick the meat right off of a carcass. In fact, it's interesting when you look at different places in the Bible, when it talks about the birds of the air, oftentimes it's talking about the birds of the air eating the flesh of carcasses or bodies. So, like, for instance, when Goliath sees David in chapter 17 of 1 Samuel, he says, what am I, a dog that you send out a stick? Like, you're going to send out a little stick? He goes, I'm going to give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field this day. He's basically, I'm going to kill you, and your body is going to get eaten by animals and birds. David, in response, says, you come at me with a javelin, a spear, and a sword. I come at you in the name of the Lord. And interesting, I just noticed this when I was looking up these passages. He says, I will give the army of the carcasses of the army of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. In the book of Revelation and Ezekiel and other places, it talks about armies being gathered together. In fact, there's even a place in the book of Revelation where there's John hears a voice, and the voice says to the birds, "Come to the feast." Let's see. It says, a voice says, "Come gather together for the supper of the great God, that you may eat." So actually, he's calling on the birds, that you may eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses, and those who sit on them, and the flesh of all people, free and slave, both small and great. And then in a few verses later, it says that all of the birds were filled with their flesh. So the idea of birds eating flesh was a common picture in the ancient world. Also, possibly if you live out in the country, you probably see it all the time. Um, but what I would also it's interesting to me, and I'm looking at this story, as I'm looking at the story, reading the story, trying to get as much out of it as I can. I was also listening to some other YouTube videos on the story, uh, reading as much as I could about it. One of the things that kind of jumped out at me is you have the two symbols that pop up are there's a cup of wine and bread. And there's other places in the Bible that talk about the cup of wine and the bread. And I think of communion, where Jesus takes the bread and he breaks it and he says, "This is my body broken for you." Now he's describing actually being hung on a cross. This particular guy is going to get his head cut off and hung. Um, and his and so the bread, he says, "This is my body." So the bread being the body is not necessarily even the first time or the last time we'll see it in the Bible. I'm pretty sure that when the people whoever wrote this, Moses wrote this down, the story, I'm sure he wasn't thinking of communion when he thought of it. But you also see the bread and the wine when Melchizedek comes and presents the bread and the wine to and gives them to Abraham. So it's it's kind of interesting. And then I started thinking about the phrase "remember me." And then I remember, then again, I'm going back to the communion, and it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, it says that he broke the bread and he said, "Take this and eat it. Do this in remembrance of me." And he takes the cup and he said, "Drink it. Do this in remembrance of me." Like, this is my blood shed, the blood of the new covenant shed for many. So it's this weird kind of thing that's kind of in the story, although the story literally says what it literally says. But I'm just saying that sometimes when I see other things kind of woven into the same story, that doesn't mean that those things aren't there deliberately, that God doesn't put things like that in the Bible for us to kind of you know allow us to meditate on the story. When I also think of the term "remember me," I also think about the fact that Jesus was on the cross and he had two thieves in between him. And one of the thieves said, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus said to him, "Assuredly, I say to you, you shall be with me in paradise." Which, again, kind of weird parallel with this story, is you have three men who are being punished. Only one of them is innocent, and one of them is pardoned and forgiven and restored, and the other one is condemned and is damned. Again, I'm sure that they weren't thinking of this when they wrote this, but I also think that the Holy Spirit takes these stories and he embeds in them types and shadows of Christ. They're woven throughout the whole Bible. But so like the thing is that if you have a dream, one of the things that I would I would encourage, other than praying and saying, Lord, show me what this means, kind of just allow yourself to kind of brainstorm. What do these images make you feel? What do they make you think? Certain images might make you feel a certain way, but they could make someone else feel differently. If somebody presents you with a kind of food that you really like, um, well, then it's going to mean something very positive in your dream. Whereas if it's that same food being presented to somebody who really hates that food, well, then that is going to have a different significance for them. So the person who's having the dream also kind of has an effect on what that dream would mean. So, but I see this here, and then we're about the end of this chapter, and it said, "Now it came to pass in the third day." So he tells them that in 3 days, tells the cupbearer that you're going to be restored to your position, you're going to get your old job back, and the second guy, he tells him you're going to be executed and die, and the birds are going to eat your flesh. So basically, at this point, there's 3 days going by, and it's real easy to tell whether or not his interpretations were accurate. I'm really reluctant to give, and it's been very rare that I get a dream or I hear a dream that somebody else tells me that I would say, oh yeah, I know 100% what that means. There have been sometimes, but again, when there's an element of predicting something in the future, we need to use caution because, well, we might make ourselves look stupid if we start telling people that something's going to happen in 3 days and it doesn't happen in 3 days. And that's the other thing, is that how does he know it's not 3 weeks? How does he know it's not 3 years? How is it that, I mean, vines don't bud, flower, and produce grapes in 3 days. They just don't. At least as far as I know, they don't. I'm pretty sure it takes a little bit longer than that. So I'd say that he must have just been able to discern that by the Spirit of God. And one of the things that I would also just to point out, and I see this in other places, it'll talk, he says, do not interpretations belong to God. Sometimes in the New Testament, they talk about interpretation of tongues, but I think that a lot of times I'll hear people talking about it as though it's a translation of tongues, like, oh, this means this. It's very specific, but it's actually an interpretation of that message. So in this particular, so it's not super. You see the images in the dream, you hear the dream, you hear the words going on in the dream, and then there is an element of you're interpreting, what does this mean? It's not as easy as, oh, well, this one thing means that, and this one thing means that, and this other thing means that. There was a guy who, very respected, wrote a book in the charismatic world. He wrote a book on dreams and dream interpretation. And when I got it, I just did not like it. He was very dogmatic about what certain things always meant, and there was no flexibility. And he seemed like he didn't even recognize the fact that the way God would speak to me is different than the way that he would speak to him. And maybe his little system worked really good for him, but I just thought, you're going to package this little system and you're presenting it to people, but you're kind of not really allowing for a variety. I don't really. Some dream books some dream like gives you a symbol, like what the images might mean or whatever, they could be helpful to get you to kind of jar your mind, to get you to think in that way. um, but again, I wouldn't be real dogmatic about that, and I kind of try to steer away from a book that tells me, oh, this is 100% of what you need to know about interpreting dreams, because interpretations belong to God, and we need to rely on the Holy Spirit to give us those interpretations. So to conclude this chapter, in verse 20, it says, "Now it came to pass on the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. But then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." So, at least here in the story, Joseph is still stuck in jail. And the guy he thought might be the key to getting him out, was going to help him out, totally forgot about him. Maybe he was just like so happy to be back in his own position, and also probably that his head was still attached to his body was probably a great relief to him, and he was pretty happy about it. But we'll see in the next chapter that eventually he does remember Joseph, and the timing turns out to be just about perfect. In fact, if he would have gotten him out earlier, Joseph might have disappeared and never been able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams in the next chapter. And if he wasn't able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, then he wouldn't have got promoted to a position of authority overseeing the food stores and been able to save his brothers and his father, and his whole family. So things work out in a very strange way sometimes, and sometimes it's not the way that we would pick. But that doesn't mean that God's hand isn't in it, that he isn't directing us and moving us into the places that we would want, that he wants us to be. And that's encouraging, because there's a whole bunch of places that I've found myself in my life, and wasn't real happy that I was there. And sometimes I couldn't really see any of the good that could possibly be worked out from what was going on. But you know what? It says in Romans 8:28 that God works all things together for good to those that love God and are the called according to his purpose. And so he works all things together for good. Not everything that happens is good, but he can take something bad and work it out for your good. And so I think that'll be it for today. Just want to end us in prayer. And some of the prayers that I really like, I really like the prayers of Paul as I find them in Ephesians. There's two prayers, chapter 1 and chapter 3. There's another prayer in the chapter, I believe it's in chapter 1 of Philippians. And then there's also a prayer in the beginning of Colossians. And he starts off in chapter 1, verse 9. It says, "For this reason we also, since we heard of it, do not cease to pray for you and to ask." And so I'm just going to read this prayer. I'm going to change it so that it's praying for you. So I'm praying for us. So Father God, I just ask that those who are listening now may be filled with the knowledge of your will, O God, and all wisdom and spiritual understanding, that they may walk worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing you, being fruitful in every good work, increasing in the knowledge of God, strengthened with all might, according to your glorious power, for all patience and long suffering with joy, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified us to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in the light. God, I pray that you would just give us ears to hear what it is that you're saying to us. Teach us, guide us, fill us with knowledge, with wisdom, with understanding, and with the knowledge of what it is that you want us to do, what your will for us is. And so I just ask that your Holy Spirit would just be loosed and poured out in our life to overflowing. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you. Until next week, have a blessed week.